What you are voting for is, having better conditions of oppression rather than getting rid of occupation and apartheid altogether. Now, people understand that. If you have serious discussions with it, people understand that. And you are right. People are worried that this might lead to eruption of violence again.
Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. At Mondoweiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. I am Adam Horowitz. In this episode, we will be discussing elections. On March 23rd, Israel held its fourth national election in 2 years. And starting in May, Palestinians in the occupied territory will be holding their first elections in 15 years. Both elections will serve as a referendum on the current leaders, and both will undoubtedly give us insight into what the future may hold, both for Palestinians living under Israeli occupation and perhaps Palestinians worldwide. In our first discussion, Mondoweiss founder and senior editor Phil Weiss talks with the Israeli human rights activist and blogger Yossi Gurvitz to unpack the results of the Israeli election and to discuss what comes next. Then we will share 2 interviews our Palestine correspondent Yumna Patel conducted about the upcoming Palestinian elections.
Hi, Yossi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your coming on to share your insights today on a pretty important day. And how are you doing?
Calm, I think. This is, that was, the results were well within the expected results. I'm not surprised either way.
I stayed up late to watch Netanyahu give his speech at 2:30 in the morning, your time. And at that time, the exit polls were saying that it wasn't a clear path to victory for either side, the anti-Netanyahu parties or Netanyahu's right-wing bloc, but that it appeared that Netanyahu has the easier path. Can you update us on all that and where we are and whether there is any sort of definitive reading from either the exit polls or the returns now in Israel?
Okay, first thing first, the semi-final results will be delivered on Friday. They're not final, but they will give us a much better look at how many seats each party will have. At the moment, things have changed from last night. At the moment, and this is with after the counting of 87.8% of the votes, the anti-Netanyahu bloc has 61 seats, while the pro-Netanyahu bloc has 59. So technically, it's a majority for the anti-Netanyahu bloc, but this bloc is fractured along several lines, and I don't think it will manage to create a stable coalition.
To be clear, the pro-Netanyahu bloc, are you including Yamina in that 59?
Yes, okay. Yes.
And where is Ram? Did Ram make the threshold there?
Ram, according to the latest information, has cleared the goal and now has 5 seats.
If those results hold, I assume that Yesh Atid and Yair Lapid would be the second largest vote getter. Given that the 61 exists on that side, does that mean that Rivlin would ask Lapid to try to form a coalition first? Or tell me how things would work and tell me whether there is any possibility of that 61 knocking out Netanyahu by your estimation.
Well, Rivlin will consult with the leaders of each party and he will ask each party to nominate a prime minister. And this time he will press them. He has semi-officially said so. He will not allow them to any wiggle room. They will have to provide a prime minister. I don't see how the 61 current anti-Netanyahu bloc will be able to provide one. The bloc contains both nationalist parties and the joint list. Several parties, including Sa'ar, have already said publicly they will not sit with Meretz in a coalition, and certainly not with a joint list. So this is a stumbling block, and I don't see how they can get over it. It's not something the voters will take lightly, especially not Sa'ar's voters. In the same time, Netanyahu has publicly said he is going to collect deserters from other parties. Again, Sa'ar's party seems to be the most fragile at the moment. So presumably Netanyahu can collect 2 or 3 deserters and somehow create a coalition. Then again, it will be extremely hard for him, as his coalition is also fissile and it contains the Zionist religious party, which is an amalgamation of several extreme right groups. Many of them hate each other, and some of them are particularly Ben Gvir's Kahanists, have a long history of, throwing Molotov cocktails at coalitions. So they will not be easy partners in any way. They will have to maintain their extremism, and they will therefore have to demand things Netanyahu cannot simply allow to happen. At the moment, I think the most likely scenario is a 5th round of elections.
First, I don't know exactly the numbers here. How many did Religious Zionism get? How many seats did they get by the latest count?
6 seats.
And how many did Meretz get?
5.
And Labor?
Labor got 7.
So we see this right-wing racist party that includes Smotrich and Ben Gvir.
And now also Noam, which is an extremely, even by Smotrich standards, right-wing religious party. Their main issue is homophobia. They're quite strong on it.
Yair Lapid was talking about a racist and homophobic coalition that Netanyahu was forming. He was referring specifically to Noam and to Ben Gvir and Smotrich.
Yeah, because during the last few days of the campaign, Netanyahu did everything he could to make certain that the National Religious Party would cross the threshold. And he succeeded. He succeeded. He was trying everything he could to do to break Bennett. I think he succeeded because in last week's polls, Bennett had 11 seats or 13 seats, depending on the poll, and now he has 7. I want to get to the bigger picture, and because we're a little bit, Americans may not understand these numbers so well, but we're talking about these smaller parties and some sort of juggernaut parties that were thought to be real kingmakers or players in this that have sort of risen and fallen over the last few weeks. One of them was Gideon Sa'ar's party breaking away from Likud. And at times, Gideon Sa'ar was seen as the next great hope of right-wing politics in Israel, and his party was polling as high as, I think, 16 or 17 seats. Yeah. And it faded. It faded in the end. And I don't know where they landed, but explain why Sa'ar is also. And now you say that Sa'ar's party, Netanyahu is going to try to cannibalize Sa'ar's party, which was an anti-Netanyahu party. He's going to try to cannibalize that party in order to get over the 61. Where did Sa'ar's party land, and why did it collapse in the manner that it did? Basically, Sa'ar is possibly the least charismatic politician in Israel. And people were supporting him in the hope he would break Netanyahu. Sa'ar was a rival within Likud. Netanyahu ate him up and basically almost threw him out of the party. So finally, Sa'ar left the party, created his own. At the last moment, and we don't know why, at least not yet, it seems many of Sa'ar's voters decided to go back to where they came from originally, which is blue-white. Blue-white was supposed to be wiped out, and at the moment, it has 8 seats. Nobody foresaw. People said they will either not cross the threshold or cross it by a small margin. Apparently, they ran a very good campaign.
Yossi, I'm about to ask you for the bigger picture to explain what all this means in terms of Israeli society, whether we can say anything about how right-wing, how left-wing, what the state of the left is, what the state of the right is. That's the big picture here. But one more drill-down question. Mm-hmm. Is there any possibility that because there is this deadlock, is there any chance that the rotation, and given blue and white's strong showing, is there any chance that the rotation agreement, which was the kind of unity deal that came out of the last election between Benny Gantz and a blue and white and Benjamin Netanyahu, is there any chance that that rotation agreement will be revived by Rivlin and say this is how you can, and that Gantz would again fold into the Netanyahu camp? And
okay. There's a curious legal loophole. They basically changed the basic government law, and they wrote into the law a date in November this year, by which Benny Gantz will become prime minister. Now, technically, if Benny Gantz leaves and is a member of Knesset by that date, according to law, he will be prime minister. So if I were Gantz, what I would try to do is steal some time, get a new election in July or August, then run on the premise that after the elections, he will automatically become prime minister.
Why?
This is a curveball. Nobody knows whether it will happen. Nobody knows whether it will survive a challenge in the High Court of Justice. But this is a possibility. And if I were Gantz, that's what I would aim at.
And just to be clear, he can't do that with the current election results. He couldn't do that stall. You have to form a government now, and he won't go in with Netanyahu to form a new government.
All he has to do is wait for Netanyahu not to fail at forming a government. Failing that, he would say that it's a nice government you've got here. I've got the law, and now you have to change the basic law again and face another challenge in the High Court of Justice. Let's see if you can do that, and then somehow survive to November.
Do you assign that possibility any type of likelihood? What do you think the chances are of Benny Gantz playing his card so well are?
Remote. He's one of the least capable politicians the nation has ever seen. But if everyone else fails at forming a government, this might actually work. I think it would be a disgrace because, that's not what the voters wanted in any way. That's basically, there was a new election, there has to be a new government, the earlier Knesset is gone, this shouldn't have any importance, but they round it through into a basic law. And now changing, that was why Gantz agreed to join the government. He said, look, I'm going to force Netanyahu to take him at his word because I'm shackling him to the new basic law. And now we're all going to have to live with this disaster.
One more detailed question before we get to the big picture. The Ram passed the threshold more than, you say, and has 5 seats, the Islamist Palestinian Party. Mm-hmm. And the joint list ended up with 7 or 8, is that correct?
6.
So the joint list from having 15 seats in last May's election has gone down to the 2 components, Ram and the joint list, have together, the Palestinian parties are now at 11. Is that correct?
That's correct, assuming the number stands.
And where is Ram on, what's the latest on whether Ram would be part of a Netanyahu governing coalition?
Mansour Abbas, the leader of the party, said that during the night, first he said, we are going to pass the threshold. And they did. And then he said, we are not a part of any bloc. We will act as we deem fit.
And what does that mean?
It means he's going to extract a very high price from anyone who is trying to form a coalition. He has already agreed to meet with Lapid later this week. And Lapid, a few weeks ago, wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole.
So Lapid, as this, we began this discussion by your telling me that Lapid has 61 seats, ostensibly, in anti-Netanyahu potential coalition.
No, actually, Lapid is basically the one person who cannot become prime minister.
Okay.
He has acknowledged that. He said he is willing to be a coalition partner in any coalition that will replace Netanyahu, but he will not seek the prime ministership himself.
Okay.
He knows he has too many enemies.
You've given me a scenario by which Benny Gantz might replace Netanyahu. Is there any other scenario by which a centrist or a right-winger would replace Netanyahu, given those that there's rich material in anti-Netanyahu force constituency? You have 61 seats and you have Ram, so that's 66 total. Is that correct?
No, so Ram would be part of the 61.
Oh, okay. So is there any other scenario you can give us by which Netanyahu would be replaced? You've given us the scenario by which Gantz would do it. Is there any way that Saar or I can't imagine Lieberman, but you've said Lapid can't do it. Is there any way that who else could replace Netanyahu?
Well, basically, I think they were thinking Saar when he was supposed to have 11, 13 seats. Now he has 6 and possibly 5. So it's not feasible for a party of 5 seats to claim the prime ministership. It can't happen.
I see.
He wouldn't have the votes to run his own government.
I see.
So basically, Netanyahu has an advantage here because his party is supposed to have 30 seats, 31 maybe, and he will have an easier way of forming a government. I think Lieberman might be able to do it. God save us all. And since Gantz has 8 seats now, which is more than Lieberman.
Oh, Lieberman has 7?
Has 7, yeah. So Gantz may attempt to create a coalition. Will anyone actually talk to him is a good question. Basically, like I said, there's a 61 block, but it's too fractured to hold.
Is there any way that Reuven Rivlin, the president of Israel, who is the one who, helps broker these agreements, right? Is there any way that Rivlin would knock heads together and say, damn it, you are making Israel an international farce in terms of democracy with 4 elections in under 2 years. Get over these differences and take out Netanyahu, get rid of Netanyahu. You have enough and put Benny Gantz. Is there any way he could say, Lapid, Gantz, Saar, get it together, Lieberman, together you have, 45 seats or whatever with labor and merits, 55, and you see where I'm going. Is there any way that Rivlin could affect such a deal?
He could. Peres certainly would have, but doing so would be considered violating his oath of office, and I don't see Rivlin doing that. He's very strictly a man of honor. So he may nudge people, but he will not, put him in the room and say, that's what we're going to do. That's not what the president does. So I don't see that happening. I can see him giving the first chance to whomever the anti-Netanyahu coalition thinks of. And since Passover is beginning in a few days, they will have a lot of time to think of it before coming before Rivlin. The semi-official results will be on Friday. Saturday, it's Shabbat. We don't do business. Sunday is Passover. So basically, they will have 4 or 5 days before Rivlin officially speaks with anyone.
So you are saying that there's a chance that Rivlin will turn first to the anti-Netanyahu bloc to form a new government?
Yes, particularly if there are about 500,000 votes, which are in double envelopes. These are the votes of the soldiers, diplomats, many corona patients, and the fabled merchant marine, which I think there are about 15 of them at the moment. But that's a famous refrain here. We're still waiting for the votes of the merchant marine. Mm-hmm. But since we had a low number of voters this time, and low number of voters generally supports the more extreme parties, we can expect Meretz or the joint list to gain perhaps one more seat. And that, again, will shift the ground. But that's speculation. We don't know.
But that speculation entails the possibility that there will be only a growth in the anti-Netanyahu bloc to the point that Rivlin will say, you folks, you form the new government, and some sort of grand coalition that goes all the way from Gideon Sa'ar and Lieberman to the joint list and Meretz forms the next government of Israel.
There was speculation that if Bennett joins the anti-Netanyahu bloc, while there's a tacit agreement that the joint list will stay out of the coalition, but not vote against it, then there will be a 54 bloc bigger than the Netanyahu bloc, which can sustain a coalition. What everyone is saying is sustain a coalition until Netanyahu's trial gets into real action. Once that begins, all you have to do is survive a few more months, let the courts do their job, and then once he is removed as a political power, dissolve the coalition. But this is a nightmare coalition. It couldn't do anything. It couldn't pass a budget. If it can't pass a budget, it's automatically dissolved.
That would be 54 plus 11 outside Palestinian parties as an outside voting bloc. Is that correct?
Yes, which means this is a nightmare scenario. I mean, this would be a headless government with someone who's coming from a party with 6 or 7 seats, which will have to fight daily for its existence. And that's not even mentioning the possibility of, a capital scenario.
I don't know what that means.
Massive right-wing mobs storming the
Oh, I see. Yossi, it's 25 minutes. I told you I'd keep you for 20 this morning. I want you to conclude by an election is a picture of a society. What does this election tell you about where Israel is? I want your sort of sum up. I've been peppering you with questions, keeping you from making any sort of grand statement at all or grand explanation. And so please, can you interpret this election? Can you give me a bottom line and picture of where Israel is?
Ansel Pfeffers wrote something in Haaretz today. I think it would be translated into English, and I think he hit the nail on the head. He said basically the Knesset now contains 20 seats of racist, Jewish supremacist parties, and they're coming into their own, and they're not going anywhere. If in the past they were masquerading or they failed to pass the threshold, that's no longer the case. We have Smotrich, Ben Gvir, and Noam in the Knesset now. And since the Orthodox parties, Shas and Yadut Torah, were forced to fight against this party because at least 1 seat or 2 seats of the religious nationalist party come from ultra-Orthodox voters. The Orthodox parties had to become more extreme. Yadut Torah published for the first time, and that's a bit historical here, a manifest saying they are a right-wing party. They will not support any withdrawals from the West Bank. They support Netanyahu. They're a right-wing party now. That's lifting some veils of the country. The revanchist right and the I wouldn't say fascist because they're not, and not populist either. The Volkisch is coming into its own. What matters is if you're a Jew, and not much else does. That was an underground movement for a few decades now, but now it's on the surface.
And just to be clear, this means you were talking about religious Zionism with its 6 or 7 seats. You're talking about Shas and UTJ in that. Now UTJ. Shas has always been right wing in that sense, right? And then you would include Bennett too. I want to understand how large a faction this is.
I would say that would be UTJ, United Torah Judaism, Shas, and religious Zionism. I'm not sure Bennett will go that way because he was going out of his way to gather secular voters, and he always had problems with rabbis as a force in politics. They never liked him, and he never liked them. He has, he's wearing what we call, as a derogative, a delinquent's yarmulke, a very small yarmulke that criminals were in court.
There were signs that the center was going to oppose this Volkisch element in Israeli politics in this election. Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, I guess even Saar, leave alone the left, which is opposed to these politics, that these centrists said, we do not want an Israel that is so intolerant. Do you see that as that the Volkisch will be met by a center, more secular center that's going to say, no, this is not the future of Israel?
To quote Yates, the center cannot hold. The center has no strong beliefs either way. Saar is not centrist. Saar is a harsh right-wing man. He persecuted the African refugees like no other minister did. He was one of the main supporters of the nationality law. He was always to the right of Likud. Lapid, Lieberman has no convictions. During this election campaign, he denounced his own support for the nationality law, presumably because it was getting voters. Lapid, he dislikes the Volkisch element, but that's because they're unseemly. They look bad on camera. And what's important to Lapid and much of the center is how things look. They want to present a nice face to the world, particularly now with the ICC breathing down their necks. And the Volkisch elements are going to make this very, very difficult.
In the near term or also in the long term?
Oh, wow. We've been having 4 elections in 2 years. I'm not sure I can actually predict any long term. But I think that the threshold has been crossed here. Once the Volkisch element actually got into the Knesset, which they didn't manage to do since Kahana in 1984, I don't see them losing their seats. I think a threshold has been crossed. Some element of shame is removed, and I think they're now a fixture. I could be totally wrong. Okay, This is. I have no idea what will happen in the next election. I have no idea when the next election will take place. But I think they're here to stay.
Who is the next prime minister of Israel, and what is your degree of sorrow, depression, demoralization right now, Yossi? What's your mood about all this?
Actually, I'm quite pleased. Meretz survived, which was not a given. Labour basically reinvented itself and went from 0 seats in the polls when it all started to 7 seats. I think Merav Michaeli is the new leader of the left. That's not precisely good news because she acknowledged she does not want to talk about the occupation. But they're basically, she's a very elegant and eloquent speaker, and she can get people around her. And once she proved she can do that, because it was not at all clear she could, I think that we will slowly see over the next few elections elements of old Labour coming back home. This will mean shrinkage of blue-white, shrinkage of Yesh Atid, possibly something more coherent that a future anti-Netanyahu coalition can rely on. I have no expectations of Saar, no expectations of Lieberman, and very low expectations of Lapid. Once again, because this coalition can't hold. Mm-hmm. There are too many opposing elements in it. So, to sum, Netanyahu will be prime minister because he is the current prime minister, mm-hmm. until he will be unseated either in the next polls or by being convicted in court. And of course, unless the strange vision of Gantz getting into office by law in November actually happens. I think this law is going to cause many people a lot of headaches in the coming weeks. They will have to, fix it. I don't think they have the votes. So this is going to be one nightmare scenario.
Well, Yossi, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your insights, and I thank you for your time, and I wish you the best.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Al-Shabaka Senior Analyst Dr. Yara Hawari and Mondoweiss contributing writer Dr. Haidar Eid both share their thoughts about Palestinian politics and whether democratic elections are even possible under Israeli occupation.
The upcoming Palestinian elections came somewhat as a surprise to many Palestinians who have been waiting, for more than 14 years now for the chance to exercise their right to vote. Many people argue that a large part of the motivation behind Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas's choosing to hold the elections now has to do with his desire to gain more legitimacy for the PA on the international stage, particularly in front of the new U.S. administration. From your understanding, could you just give us some more insight into what sort of the main motivators were behind holding the elections now, and how much influence did international and regional players have in that decision?
Yeah, of course. I think there's been, both external and internal pressures on both Abbas and the PA itself to have elections, not just presidential, but also legislative council elections. The internal pressures come from civil society, which has been quite vocal in their opposition to the lack of the PA's democratic mandate, but also internal people within Fatah and within the various political factions who perhaps it would be to give them too much credit to say that they're concerned about the lack of democracy, but also, I think an important point to note is that they also have their own interests, and they want their own piece of the pie. And the external pressures, of course, come from the donor community. The international donor community spend a lot of money on the Palestinian Authority, and it becomes increasingly, as every year goes by without elections, it becomes increasingly more difficult to justify that money. At the end of the day, this is a regime that is well past its electoral mandate, over a decade past its electoral mandate, and the same goes for President Abbas. And it becomes a sort of a source of embarrassment for the donor community. Now, all of this is to say that we're still, not 100% sure that these elections will go ahead. They have gone further than any other sort of calls for elections in the past. There has, been a registration period. We have actual dates, but more recently, various analysts and commentators have been now wondering if they will go ahead at all because of the sort of various barriers, political, but also, sort of circumstantial barriers because of the pandemic. So we're still not 100% sure that these will take place.
Speaking of the different sort of internal barriers that are already starting to come up, last week, the Fatah Central Committee announced that the party would be running as one list in the elections, and there have been reports that Abbas has essentially threatened that any Fatah official who runs outside the faction's official list would be punished. Other political factions have called on Abbas as well to hold a national meeting to agree on, different issues before the election. And that's something that he's also refused to do so far. And it's seeming increasingly likely that Abbas and the PA might go ahead with the elections via presidential decree, as you said, if they do in fact go through. With the current trends that you're seeing and the way that some of the lists are already being decided within the ruling party of the PA, do you think that these elections can truly be described as democratic and representing the hopes and desires of the Palestinian people? What are these elections in their current form actually offering to the Palestinian people in terms of change and in terms of something new?
Well, in a very sort of quick answer to that question, I don't think that they offer much, and I don't think that they are a manifestation of democracy. An important point that I didn't mention in the previous question, that these elections are also assigned to the Biden administration, right? The PA has with the Trump administration was totally marginalized and had no seat at the table, and so this is also assigned to the Biden administration, that they're now ready to play ball and to sit at the table with the grown-ups. And so, with all of that in mind, and the sort of the other factors that I mentioned, I think these elections do not come from a place of real will for sort of democracy, democratic practice. They don't come from a place of really wanting to give Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza that opportunity to express themselves democratically. And so this is very much political theatrics. And whilst that might be said of all, all elections, indeed, all around the world, ruling parties call for general elections at very strategic moments. So, it's not necessarily an anomaly in Palestine. But what is different here is that this is not a democratic context. There isn't free space for democratic expression. The fact that these elections were called so quickly and with such little time for people to prepare demonstrates that very well. It's a repressive political atmosphere. As well as I do that journalists, activists, students are routinely arrested by the Palestinian security forces for voicing political opposition, routinely harassed. There's a lot of online censorship going on. There really isn't that space for totally free democratic practice. Now, some might argue that Palestinian civil society is strong and it does voice opposition, and that is a sign of a democratic society. So it can't be that bad. But Palestinian civil society, NGOs and organizations cannot replace political parties. The NGOs and civil societies can't be that sort of substitute political opposition. And that's what's happened, unfortunately. And so it provides this great smoke screen that actually, there is democratic practice in Palestine because of the existence of the civil society. But that's not the case. And the political institution knows that very well.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, how these elections could essentially benefit the PA and show that they're ready to, be taken seriously and sit at the table with the U.S. administration, et cetera. But how would these elections also serve to, more personally benefit Abbas and sort of the upper echelons of the PA, both at home and abroad? What would sort of the repercussions of having these elections now be in terms of those specific players?
So many have described these elections really as a sort of a power sharing agreement between the powers that be, the powers that already exist, the elites that already run the show. And I think that is true. I think, they wouldn't call for elections if there was a real challenge to their dominance. And Abbas being announced as the sort of official Fatah candidate just really sums everything up. He's been president for a decade and a half. He rules increasingly by presidential decrees, which lack any kind of accountability or representational or present any representational voice. And I think that just, that sums him up and his character and the way that he governs. It sums it up very well. And so I don't think that they would call the elections if they thought there was any real challenge to that. I think they are surprised by the sort of the internal grumblings within Fatah. We've heard a lot about different potential candidates, different sort of breakaway lists, people really unhappy within Fatah that Abbas is running again. And perhaps they weren't as prepared as they should have been for that. So it will be interesting to see how the next few months sort of evolve internally and with, the various different lists. But I think something that's important to know is that this is not, if the elections do go ahead, this is not going to be like any sort of usual election campaign or run up to general elections, because of course there is the pandemic, and whilst a lot of places are sort of, opening up and seeing their populations being vaccinated, the West Bank and Gaza has gone under a renewed lockdown, one that is very reminiscent of the one that was imposed a year ago. The schools and universities have been closed, shops have been closed, people are not allowed to drive in the streets, walk outside of their neighborhoods. So this, really begs the question of, is this a conducive space for elections? How do people mobilize? I mean, already there isn't that democratic space to do so freely. Already it was a very tight space, and now it's even tighter yet, especially because the main areas of traditional political mobilization, such as universities and workspaces, have been shut down. So there are a lot of questions still to be had. I mean, we have quite a few weeks away before the elections are supposed to take place. The first elections at the end of mid to end of May, and then later the presidential elections at the end of July. So there's still time for things to change, but there are a lot of unknowns that I don't think we can answer at the moment.
Another major point of contention, for these elections has been the inclusion of Palestinians living in occupied East Jerusalem and Palestinians living in the diaspora. Until now, Israel is still refusing to allow the participation of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and the PA has said that the elections wouldn't include the millions of Palestinians in the diaspora. My question is, how is it possible, to hold real, fair elections that can bring about significant change in these conditions? And what kind of democracy is really possible under the constraints of, the ongoing Israeli military occupation?
That's a very good question. And the short answer is that you cannot have a democracy under Israeli military occupation. And the reason for that is because Israel doesn't want to see a true flourishing Palestinian democracy. And we see that demonstrated by the fact that they constantly arrest activists and political, figures. The Israeli prisons are full of thousands of political prisoners. And so if political activities, mobilizations are punished by the Israeli regime, how can you expect for that to sort of translate into a Palestinian democracy, not to mention all the sort of infrastructural and sort of real material barriers that they put in the way, such as the deliberate fragmentation of the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza and beyond. This is something that's not being talked about much, is the sort of very nitty-gritty aspects of elections, the very real aspects. Where do the polling stations go? How do Palestinians in Area C get to polling stations when presumably the Israelis won't allow the PA to set up polling stations in Area C? How will Palestinians in East Jerusalem vote if there aren't, if the Israelis are forbidding them to set up polling stations in East Jerusalem? Will they have to go to the West Bank to vote? And if they vote in the West Bank, will they be at risk of losing their permanent residency? Because the Israeli regime might choose to punish East Jerusalemites who vote in PA elections. And that's not to mention, the diaspora community, all the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are not at all going to be represented in these elections, even though there is a call for Palestinian National Council elections at the end of the summer, in which all Palestinians are supposed to be represented in that body. There is no, there haven't been any moves to sort of to make that happen. There's been no registration of Palestinians in the diaspora. There's so many barriers in the way, and I'll be very interested to see how the PA attempts to address these. From what I've seen so far, they really aren't doing the best job at it.
If these elections, do go through and the current status quo within the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership is essentially just upheld and reinforced, what are the long-term effects that could have on Palestinian society and, the larger struggle for Palestinian liberation? Would you consider that to just be another, setback for however many years into the future? Or, what can you say about that as the long-term effects?
I think these elections have the potential to set the Palestinian people back a lot. I mean, if you look when the last elections were held over a decade and a half ago, it sort of gave legitimacy for the current ruling regime to continue for as long as it has done without elections. So is this going to give whoever, another 15 years of life? Is it going to give Abbas, sort of just more legitimacy to do what he wants to do, and then to sort of prop up a successor? So there are all these, big overarching questions. But I think it's also a distraction technique. We can't shy away from the fact that people are excited about the elections. There was a high registration, even though it's important to note that, the PA is really promoting the high registration percentage. I think it's 93%. Many of those were registered from the last time they voted. But there is an air of sort of interest, at least we can say. And that's because it's a novelty. It is a novelty for a lot of people, a lot of Palestinians. The majority of Palestinians are young people. They have not ever had the chance to vote. So this is a novelty. It's something new. And it's really sad, because I think a lot of people's hopes will be crushed. I think that the sort of the initial excitement around it soon will be crushed, and I think it will have long-lasting effects on Palestinian society. And it's really is wasted energies, I think, to focus on this kind of election in this kind of atmosphere.
I want to finish off with a question for you, as a member of the Palestinian youth. What do you think needs to be done in order to have or open up a space for meaningful democracy in Palestine and to move Palestinians closer to achieving sovereignty and liberation, rather than, what you described as sort of this wasted energy on these elections?
Well, I think there has to be a sort of decentralization, or sort of we have to take away the focus from the PA. The PA is not a representational body. It was very much a service-providing body that was created by the Oslo Accords. And so I think the importance of the PA, the focus on the PA, has to be, worn down. Like, it's not our representative body. The PLO is supposed to be the body that represents all Palestinians where they might be, and it has been totally subsumed by the PA and by Abbas and his cronies. And so really, I don't have the answer for that question, because I think it's so broad. But the answer, we can't look for the answer within PA elections. We're not going to find liberation, true democratic representation within the PA or within the current political institutions. I think we also have to demand of this current leadership, we have to demand that they step down. They are neither representative nor are they doing the Palestinian people any favors. In fact, they're an incredibly corrupt body that is doing more damage to the Palestinian cause. And so it's not an easy question to answer. And I think, unfortunately, these elections are a sort of a distraction a distraction so that people don't think about or don't come together to really think about what should be done instead.
So, the announcement of the upcoming presidential and legislative elections came as a surprise to many Palestinians. And so far, it's drawn lots of mixed reactions. Some people have been excited. Some people were excited that they are going to be able to exercise their right to vote, many for the first time in their entire lives. Others, particularly young people, have expressed feelings of disillusionment with the Palestinian leadership and the entire systems of government as they currently are. Could you give us some more insight into what you've been seeing on the ground? How have people been reacting to the news of this elections, and how are these elections being perceived? And more specifically, if you could give us some insights into how things are being perceived in Gaza, where Hamas has been the ruling authority for the past 15 years.
Right. Thank you so much, Yumna, for having me on your program. I think, it is important for people, who really want to know the situation here and give an idea about the PLC, Palestinian Legislative Council elections supposedly taking place in May. I think we need to contextualize those elections, and we need to contextualize, the agreement signed between Fatah and Hamas and even other political organizations in Cairo last month, agreeing to have those elections before having national reconciliation, which is very, very strange for us. And so many people have been raising questions about this. Yes, people want change. People are fed up. But I think, in order to understand why you have this kind of, reaction to those elections where people really want to go to the polling stations, but still they are suspicious, as I said, we need to contextualize. I think if the last elections we had were in 2006, if you remember, following assurances and promises, made by, American President George Bush at the time and British Prime Minister Tony Blair to spread democracy, of course, quote unquote, spread democracy in the Middle East. Only, of course, to see the destruction of Iran and Afghanistan. So the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were asked by the Americans and the Brits to vote and to go to the polling stations. And of course, when I say we, I am only referring to a third of the Palestinian population, only residents of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem. And when people went to the polling stations, I myself did not. Because I do not believe that you can have real and true democracy under the barrel of the gun of the occupier. But when people went to the polling station, believing that George Bush and, American imperialism wanted to spread democracy in the Middle East, people voted against the existing Palestinian National Authority government led by Fatah. And instead, they voted in favor of, I would say, what seemed at the time to be the only political force capable of challenging the remnants of the Oslo Accords at the time, which means that people in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, or rather the majority more than 60% of the people who voted at the time did not vote based on their own political perspectives, but rather to repudiate or rather to punish the Palestinian Authority. For them, and everybody knows this very well, that this is a sort of a third, worldish authority characterized by corruption, suppression of freedom, deprioritization of the national struggle, and minimization of the Palestinian people to the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And that is the essence of Oslo. They also insisted on having, the Palestinian Authority on continuing its security coordination under the oversight of, at the time it was a U.S. general. And most importantly for me, I think, from a class perspective, a steady growth of layers of, unproductive, inauthentic bureaucracy, an inauthentic middle class, comprador class, if you wish, and suppression of national forces of other opposition parties. So people did not like that. Between 1996 and 2006, people had to deal with all of this, and this is why they decided at the time to vote against the Palestinian Authority, led by Fatah. But you also need to remember that the Palestinian Authority represents 1/3 of the Palestinian people. And that, in other words, meant the transformation of Palestinian national aspirations through the marginalization, of course, of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, which is supposed to represent all Palestinian components or the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, 1948 Palestine, and in the diaspora. And unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority believed that it at the time it could establish an independent Palestinian mini-state similar to the infamous, South African Bantustans, establishing this mini-state on a fraction of the land of historic Palestine, at the same time recognizing Israel, but without asking Israel to reciprocate and recognize the rights, the basic rights of the Palestinian people, including the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And that led to a kind of bestowing, granting legitimacy on the Zionist project. And in fact, honestly, I think, this process, Oslo and what happened in 1996, and then even until 2006, had been unprecedented in the history of national liberation movements, including, since we talked about Bantustans, the so-called independent homelands of South Africa, including those Bantustans, those ethnic enclaves alleged at the time in the 70s and 80s of in South Africa, alleged to be sovereign, states, independent state within apartheid South Africa. And that is the context within which the 2006 elections took place. But since 2006 and until today, the Gaza Strip has been under a medieval, I would call it hermetic siege. So many lives have been lost. And so people are fed up. The choice that we have right now, you either vote against negotiations with apartheid Israel, i.e. vote for the right wing of the PLO, Fatah, because it is controlling the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and which means corruption, which means security coordination with apartheid Israel, which we tried between 1996 and 2006, or you vote for Hamas. Unfortunately, it's a binary. Or you vote for Hamas, and then you end up having this medieval siege interrupted by genocidal wars like what happened in 2009, 2012, and 2014. So what choices do we have? What choices do people on the ground here have? And, when the first elections, for example, were held in 1996, most left-wing and Islamic forces boycotted. It was very clear. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, etc. And the reasons that were given were largely consistent with what is proposed, by what I'm saying right now. The same reasons that remain valid. So that is the context, Yumna.
I want to focus on the reactions for a moment of Palestinian youth, because, you've spoken about sort of the context of the current elections, and, many Palestinians in their 20s and even 30s have never voted before. This is their first time sort of experiencing, this is sort of new territory for them. So how have young people been navigating this new territory of experiencing, elections for the first time? What have you perceived?
Yeah. Well, look, many of the young people I have talked to, I am a lecturer. Unfortunately, I haven't been going, of course, to varsity because of the coronavirus, but I have been having chats with my students online. And I must admit that they are excited. They want to see a change in what they perceive to be the political system. Their understanding of, what this political system means is that, look, we don't, they directly say it, look, we are fed up with the siege. Most of us have never left Gaza before. We have been living with, sporadic cuts of electricity every single day. We get only 8 hours a day of electricity. Unemployment is very more than 60% amongst the younger generation in the Gaza Strip. But the point is that there are, when I discuss with them, and we try in a way to raise, critical questions. And these young people that I have been dealing with raise these questions. I mean, what is the desired outcome of these elections? Some of them, of course, are members of Fatah, and therefore they believe that, 100% most people will vote against Hamas, etc., etc. But let me remind you, in 2006, most people believe that Fatah would win the elections, and Hamas would form a kind of strong opposition within the parliament, or rather within the legislative council. You can feel that sense amongst young people who support the Fatah party, but on the other hand, because look, you have to remember, we have this split. People look at the elections from perspective of a sort of a binary opposition, Palestinian binary opposition, Fatah and Hamas. Both are right-wing organizations. But the question that we also ask, and I address usually when I have these discussions with the younger people, are these elections radically different or distinct from those of that we had in 2006 and 1996? Well, said we never voted. Now it's different. That's their reaction. Now it is different. And we know we can punish both parties, for example. But the point is that you do not have a real third force, an alternative on the ground. Another question, for example, that we discuss: are these elections meant to address the crucial mistakes that characterized the previous two elections or resulted from them? If you want to vote, if you don't like Fatah, then you vote against Hamas. That's not a good choice, and vice versa, of course. But then there is the question: what is the alternative? And therefore, this time, will the right, and that is my question now, will the right to self-determination, as defined by every single Palestinian, appear on the ballot? And for me, and for everybody, the right to self-determination means, freedom from occupation, equality, and most importantly, the implementation of United Nations Resolution 194, which calls for the right of Palestinian refugees to return to the towns and villages from which they were ethnically cleansed back in 1948. Now, this is extremely important, Yumna, because you also you need to remember that 2/3 of the Palestinians of Gaza are refugees entitled to their right of return. So ultimately, the question is, will the electoral process include all the sectors of the Palestinian people and their aspirations, or will it, like its predecessors, that is 2006 to 1996, be, I think, exclusionary and limited? And therefore, the question that, younger generation really fails to address here is, will this elections that we are going to have help to deconstruct what I call the fetish of independence away from foreign intervention, including Israeli intervention?
So you mentioned that, a lot of the, youth that you've been speaking to, some of them are, excited and optimistic.
Yes.
Whether, about this prospect, whether it is actually, in reality, a fair chance at change and at democracy. There's also, on the other hand, we have many people, Palestinian youth, and also people from the older generation who have witnessed, the past years in post-Oslo Palestine and have seen the growth of the corruption and nepotism within their bodies of leadership. Have you noticed this feeling of disillusionment pervading certain sectors of the Palestinian population and their response to the elections? And what could you sort of attribute as the cause for this sort of phenomenon?
Yeah, the problem that I have, when people ask me about what is the reaction of, the younger generation, etc. But notice, again, you need to remember, we are talking about only 1/3 of the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. I'm also interested in the reaction of, young refugees living in the diaspora. Mm-hmm. I mean, who have never voted, who had never had the right, to vote for their representatives, whether, PLC or PNC, the Palestine National Council, or the PLO. Mm-hmm. And this is why my answer is limited to the younger generation in the Gaza Strip, right. Most of whom, are refugees. As I said, we have 8 refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. So, the question here relates to the, what I would say, just to address your point, Yumna, is the most prominent sort of link between the 2006 elections, January 2006, and the price. That is the price paid by ordinary people of its outcome. Of the outcome of the 2006 election, especially the younger generation. Now, they need to be reminded about that. The equation for me and for conscious young people has become clear. Let us be, very clear and be very critical about it. If you go to the ballot box and elect against the continuation of negotiations, dialogue with Israel, Osloization of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, negotiations through a U.S. brokered process, you will definitely face a crippling blockade. And therefore, you are going to the polling station, to the ballot box, with the gun raised against you, the gun raised to your head. And then the alternative is a brutal siege, a brutal genocidal war, with the finger of blame pointed at you because you did not choose the right. And I think, the point with the younger generation, and since you're addressing that point in the Gaza Strip, is that, look, they have no alternative. What has been going on since 2006 until today, Yumna, according to my friend Ilan Pape, is an incremental genocide. And now you are asking those people to go to the polling stations. I mean, what kind of freedom are you? I mean, we are talking about freedom of choice. I mean, what kind of freedom of choice are we talking about here? And I think, the winners of the 2006, many attempts were made by them to appease the United States, to show that, they would, accept an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 border without, of course, recognition of Israel, etc., etc. Still, the United States of America and Israel have refused to deal with them. So, and I think what we are being offered, and this is what we are trying to explain as well, is that, look, I mean, the two-state solution is a racist solution. Mm-hmm. The two-state solution that we are being offered by all those who are entering the elections, whether Hamas or Fatah, or even left-wing organizations, Stalinist left-wing organizations, is that we are being asked to accept a racist proposal, two-state solution, originally made by the Zionist left, a solution that ignores the fact that the vast majority of the Palestinian people are in the diaspora and in the 1948 territories. Now, when you raise such questions to the younger generation, of course, most of them would tell you, no, we would never accept a solution that does not guarantee our right of return. Yes, but that is what is being offered. And this, I call it, this process of Osloization, with reference to the Oslo Accords, a kind of Osloized sort of pragmatism has been accompanied by, in Gaza, for example, Hamas has been infected with the Oslo virus by accepting the two-state solution, but also has added a kind of, has applied strict religious laws without formally legalizing these laws, reflecting their ideological background. And, people are fed up with this. But so what are they going to do? The younger generation is still waiting. I can tell you, we haven't seen programs. Yet. If you are voting for Hamas, what are you voting for? In 2006, it was clear, reforms. Now, Fatah, what are you voting for? So I think we need to keep raising these questions all the time.
Yeah. This is something that you touched on in your last point, that it was very clear what platform Hamas was running on last time around, change and reform. But now, 15 years later, how are Gazans feeling about their Hamas leaders and sort of the movement as a whole going into these elections? Does Hamas still hold the same power it did back in 2006, when they could offer people a chance at something new and a change from the failed Fatah leadership? Or are Gazans feeling just as disillusioned with Hamas as many in the West Bank are feeling with the PA, and many Fatah members are feeling with their party?
Yeah, well, the general feeling you get here, Yumna, is that, yes, people are disillusioned with the Hamas leadership here in the Gaza Strip, and people want change. But look, I mean, we need to remember, Hamas has support on the ground. Hamas does have support in the ground, but as you said yourself, your question, people in the West Bank are disillusioned with the Fatah Authority, with the security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. So we are expecting, people in the West Bank to punish, the Fatah Authority in the West Bank. But at the same time, those who support left-wing organizations and Fatah supporters in Gaza are expecting, people in Gaza to punish Hamas. Now, the problem is that the Palestinian Authority has imposed, has taken punitive measures against the Palestinians of Gaza since March 2017, by cutting salaries, by stopping aid to Gaza, etc., etc. Against them, there are people who believe that they cannot vote, for, the Fatah-controlled Palestinian Authority. So they are looking at, other Fatah electoral lists like, Nasser al-Qudwa, Marwan al-Barghouti's lists. So people are still waiting. So if they want to punish, Hamas, what is the alternative? Is the alternative the Palestinian Authority and, the Ramallah Fatah? Is there another alternative? And if they want to punish both, what is that alternative? And that is an extremely important question. I mean, here there is this constructed binary between these two authorities. I mean, that was your question. I mean, Hamas on the ground here in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank. That binary, we want to transcend that binary. And it's time now to start talking about, alternatives. And honestly, if you ask me personally, I think you cannot create a radical alternative, a real alternative by joining the PLC elections. I think the alternative, those elections cannot be free. If they are held under occupation, colonization, and apartheid, and if they exclude most sectors of the Palestinian people, and therefore the only alternative that we are trying to convince people about is the PNC elections, Palestine National Council elections.
Are people worried about any sort of backlash that could happen as a result of an upset in the elections, something similar to the fighting that we saw in 2006? Is that something that people are concerned about, something that you've witnessed people discussing or not really? Because I know that's something that's very interesting, to foreign audiences at least, is just sort of how are Palestinians thinking about sort of the violence that broke out last time?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, what guarantees that it will not happen? What guarantees do you have? I mean, how can you, have such elections without the intervention of the Israelis, for example, who played a major role in creating, the clashes and the violence that took place in 2007, and ultimately leading to the split between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Because as I said, people voted at the time for Hamas, but not because they supported the Palestinian Authority. And what was the outcome? The outcome was, as I said, a medieval siege imposed on Gaza since 2007 until this moment. Gaza has 7 crossings, 6 crossings controlled completely by apartheid Israel. And the only other exit that Gaza has to the external world is the Rafah crossing, which is controlled by the Egyptians, who since 2006 have decided to close it in cahoot with apartheid Israel. So if you vote against the Palestinian Authority, that means if you vote against resumption of negotiations with apartheid Israel, meaning that you are voting against the two-state solution, you get punished. You simply get punished, and therefore people don't know what to do. Honestly, if you have serious discussions with people who are critical of what is happening, it's very strange. I mean, that will tell you. I mean, what options do we have? And this reminds me of apartheid South Africa. You remember the tricameral parliament, where people voted for colored, for Indians, in order to beautify apartheid. Legislative Council elections will not lead to the improvement of people's lives on the ground in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. What you are voting for is, having better conditions of oppression rather than getting rid of occupation and apartheid altogether. Now, people understand that. if you have serious discussions with it, people understand that. And you are right. People are worried that this might lead to eruption of violence again.
This is something that you've mentioned throughout our discussion, how it isn't really possible to have real, fair elections that can bring about significant change in these conditions. But, what kind of democracy then, if any, is really possible under Israel's ongoing military occupation? And if it's not possible at all, sort of what does need to happen in order to have a meaningful democracy in Palestine and in order to move Palestinians closer to achieving sovereignty and liberation?
Absolutely. Look, the choice here that we have here is again between, as I said, there's a binary, false, constructed binary. The choice is again between religious right and secular right, with the third necessary alternative completely absent. But yes, you are right. You can never have elections, free elections, if they're held under occupation, colonization, and apartheid. Notice the form of oppression that the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are suffering from is, direct military occupation. But you have a form of apartheid in Palestine, 1948. You have a continuing process of ethnic cleansing and colonization taking place in the West Bank. But you also have Palestinian refugees not allowed to return to the towns and villages from which they were cleansed in 1948, which means those elections are excluding the two sectors of the Palestinian people, the 1948 Palestinians and the refugees. So I'm sorry, I'm back. Are you there?
Yes, I was just sending you a message. I feared that maybe your electricity got cut out.
Yeah, exactly. That's what happened. All right. Should I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So just, to finish the point is that I think, we have these two choices. Either, continue our negotiations with apartheid Israel, continue negotiations that, will be lasting forever by design, if Fatah wins and the secular right wins, or your point, through continued blockade and genocidal wars like what happened in 2014, if the religious right again manages to surprise everybody like what happened in 2006. So what you have here is either or binary. That is the only choice we are given by the new PLC elections, which would represent only, again, let me remind you, only 1/3 of the Palestinian people. And I think it's important, Yumna, for us to start talking about, democratic alternatives. And as I said, I repeat it, and I want to repeat it again, we want an alternative that reflects the collective will of the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. Refugees, 1948 and 1967. And that alternative only lies in the elections of the Palestine National Council, PNC, and that should take place only after reconstructing the PLO. The PLO should again be a national front that represents the Palestinian people on the basis of true democracy, in order to ensure genuine representation of all national and even Islamic factions and civil society.
Haidar, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
And I think, the last thing I want to say is that, look, even though, I wouldn't say, okay, let's boycott those elections, but I would be calling for disparticipation. That's what I call it. Not voting, saying no to the PLC elections, and notice, no to PLC elections under policies of occupation, colonization, and apartheid, and yes to PNC elections, Palestine National Council, which is the Palestinian parliament, which I believe is the sole legitimate representative of the entire Palestinian people. And thank you so much, Yumna.
Thank you so much for joining us and for taking the time to speak with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to our show, a production of Mondoweiss.net. The music you heard is from Sound of Picture. Visit our site to sign up for daily or weekly email newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you would like to support our work, go to Mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a non-profit publication, and every donation helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help others find the show.